and welcome to another edition of Book Talk. I'm Stephen Ussery, and I'm happy to welcome John T. Edge to the program today. Thanks for coming in, John.
Thank you, Stephen.
John is a writer, storyteller, journalist, and communicator. He's one of the founders of the Southern Foodways Alliance, and his journalism has appeared in many outlets, including Garden and Gun and the Oxford American. He's the host and writer for the Emmy Award-winning television program, True South. He was previously on Book Talk to discuss his book, The Potlikker Papers, and today we'll be discussing his latest release, a memoir entitled House of Smoke. A Southerner Goes Searching for Home, which is published by Crown. John, House of Smoke begins with a prologue featuring a harrowing scene from your childhood. And that was a childhood that did not want for harrowing scenes.
Yeah. That prologue, which, I mean, it's if you pick up my book, you're gonna find it front and center. You know, it begins with my mother running out the back door of our house with a gun in her hand and me giving chase. That was the last thing I wrote in this book. It was the hardest thing for me to write. I put it aside. I pulled a cloak over it for a long time. But, you know, the work of memoir is to try to tell the truth and try to tell the hardest stuff. And that was the hardest thing for me. But it wasn't the only, to your point. I didn't realize until I kind of stacked up scenes, one atop the other, that you know, from time I was about 8 till I was about 16, violence was a constant in my life.
So a lot of your career has been dedicated for people in the South, especially white Southerners, to look at the history in a more honest way and to face these hard truths. What was it like doing it for your personal life?
You know, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I don't recommend memoir. And the people who say, well, it's kind of like therapy, wasn't it? And I was like, no, not at all. It was just hard. My want to tell my own story comes out of a piece I wrote for the Oxford American called My Mother's Catfish Stew. And I wrote it in like 2018 as our son was going off to college to tell the fuller story of our family. I'd kept my mother's story from our son. My mother was an alcoholic. My mother was also a gloriously unconventional and socially intelligent person. But I hadn't told Jess, our son, the fullness of that story. I hadn't told him the range of my mother's life. And I realized as he was going off to college and I was beginning to tell him the story, and then I wrote this Oxford American piece, that I'd thought before that kind of memoir was an act of selfishness, and I began to recognize memoir as an act of generosity because people responded to that story. The most difficult things I could tell about myself, they saw some of their story in mine. And that's where I've come about all of this truth-telling, you know, whether it's about your family or whether it's about the South in which you grew up and the stories the South told you, that we all live with that. If you are of my age, I'm 62. If you're in, you know, whatever age you are in the South, you inherited a roster of stories that is full of untruths. And I'm speaking to fellow white Southerners. And so if we can excavate those stories, turn them over, look at them, examine them, and get towards some story, some narrative that's closer to the truth, then we can make a little progress in this generation.
And your mother was not unique in being enamored with the myth of the lost cause.
No, my mother, there was an historical marker in front of our house, and it told the story of Alfred Iverson, who was a Confederate brigadier general. And the marker in front of our house implied that he was a hero of the Civil War. And my mother didn't really care about his service in the Civil War. He served at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. I later find out in this book that he did not serve with distinction at Gettysburg, but actually led his troops to slaughter at Gettysburg. But my mother was interested in kind of the sheen that his story gave to our own family story. It was as if she was adopting him like he was a lost uncle on a scattered, broken branch of the family tree. She reveled in the idea that he read Shakespeare by firelight, by campside during the Civil War, that he wore the gray, that he somehow represented some lost past that might somehow be revived, which is exactly textbook lost cause stuff. I didn't think about my mother that way, though. I accepted my mother. It was only after I went back to grad school and began reading more broadly and recognized what the lost cause was and how that, my childhood had been wrapped up in the kind of myth of the lost cause.
Were there any personal myths? Were the family lore that was your mom passed along to you that wasn't quite accurate?
Yeah, there were a number. She always told us that her father, for whom our son is named, he was Jesse Clifton Evans, had been a small town railroad baron, was the way my mother put it, and that he had owned a narrow gauge railroad that ran from Bowman to Branchville, South Carolina. It was the B&B. And I'd heard that he owned this railroad until they were transporting a load of cotton. The cotton burned up, took the train, and with it, the family fortunes. So in that way, the family became, this elite family. The family my mother was born into was middle class at best, but it explained the fall. Like they'd once been elite, and that train burns up, and the cotton burns up, and they fall to the middle class. And I bought that story and believed it and told it. And there was a picture from that B&B Railroad on the wall of my bedroom growing up. So one day I went to Branchville, South Carolina, and went through the archives of the B&B Railroad. I couldn't find him. He was certainly not an owner. He likely worked on the railroad, but my mother had amplified that story. She had embellished that story, and that connects to kind of the myth dealing and spinning that my mother did with Iverson, the Confederate Brigadier General. She was weaving together this narrative that in her mind left our family with a greater stance in the world, and yet all that myth-making and storytelling without grounding in truth left me unsteady in the world, not knowing what to trust.
It's almost like that Hemingway line about temporarily embarrassed capitalists.
Yeah, indeed.
So one of your best friends when you were a child, Clinton Robertson, his mother, Elizabeth, worked for your family as a domestic, and they were African-American. And it just seems like it's almost a trope now. Friendship up until about a couple years before puberty hits, and then kids are taken apart from each other.
Yeah, and it is a trope, and that's what happened with me. It was more specific with me, though, with mine and Clinton. In 1970, the Supreme Court said, actually, we're really serious this time. You need to integrate your schools. And my father actually worked for the federal judge who forced the integration of the public schools in Middle Georgia, where I grew up. My father believed in the principle of integration and worked toward it. My mother believed in the idea of it, but not so much the practice. And my mother and father argued over whether I would go to a private school in Macon, Georgia, Stratford Academy, high on a hill in a former plantation home where Jefferson Davis had been entertained after the Civil War. And my father lost the fight with my mother, the argument over it. And off I went to that private school. And in that moment, my friendships back in Jones County, in the little rural place where I grew up, Clinton, Georgia, they fractured. My relationships with my best black friends ruptured. I still kept some of those relationships because I played Little League baseball. And those kids in Little League, some of whom I'm still in touch with today, like Joe Farrer and Dwight Bowler, those maintained, but I saw that friendship with someone like Clinton splinter.
I read a recent study in which they say it still goes on today, and that the education system is one of the main reasons that happens.
Yeah, I'm a product of segregation academies and of the dance between the morality my parents carried in the heads and the kind of pressure of society that affected them. I went to a public school 1st through 3rd grade. I went to a private school 3rd through 7th. I went back to a public school because I demanded, I want to go back to the public school, and then returned to private school again in 10th grade. That whipsaw didn't do me any good. And I think, this devotion to segregation academies and a willing disinvestment in public schools does great harm to our region then, and it still does great harm now.
Now, beyond this tragedy, there was another more personal tragedy that linked the two families together, and it must have been a horrible experience for you.
Yeah.
Of course, for them as well.
It was a horrible experience for that family, even more than me. And that's one thing writing this book, so what happened is my mother and I were in the kitchen of our house, at a little kitchen table, and we were sitting there conjugating verbs. I'm 8, and we were eating salmon croquettes and grits, and I heard a little pop in the other room, and I didn't quite know what that was. And my mother didn't either, so I went to go check, and I found Clinton's older brother, Charles, on the floor of my parents' bedroom with blood coming out of his head. He died later that day in the hospital. He shot himself. We do not know why. Some people, when I talk about this, say, "Oh, he committed suicide." We don't know that. So much we don't know. I tried to find the sheriff's records. They had either been tossed in X year or suffered or lost in a flood on Y year. I can't remember the exact years, but I went looking for them. There was no record. Nothing about his death showed up in my hometown paper. It was a small thing in the Macon newspaper. In the wake of that, I don't know if I went to the funeral. I can't remember. I don't know if my parents went to the funeral. I don't know what happened the next day. Did we spend the night in the house after that? Did we go to the hospital? I mean, everything is a blank for me except the precipitating moment when I hear that gun go off and I go to find this young man. Writing this book, there's basically an apology in the back of the book to the Robertson family, because I had to figure out what happened in that house. And in doing that, I asked questions of the remaining family members that hurt them, because I brought back up this most horrible moment in their lives. And Sinesta Robertson, who is one of the little sisters of my childhood friend Clinton and a little sister to Charles, who died, she was so welcoming to me until we began to talk about that. And then she understandably shut down. I can't imagine a family suffering that. And I literally can't imagine, because I can't bring it back to life. I can just bring back that moment.
So at this point, when you realize your memory is fragile, how do you approach the rest of writing a memoir when you know that things may not necessarily be the way you remember them?
Well, I think about that a lot. I teach in a narrative nonfiction program at the University of Georgia. It's a low residency MFA, so I'm there just for a week in January and a week in August each year. And, it's based in a journalism school. And so I approached this book as a journalist, trying to reinvestigate, re-report out my life. So what I did in most cases is I tried to marry memory and cross-check it against archival research and newspaper research to test my own memory, to interrogate my memory. And then I also hired a fact checker for the whole of the book and turned her loose. She fact-checked my last book, The Potlikker Papers. She fact-checked my friend Wright Thompson's book, The Barm. She's supremely good. Katie Carter King. But I asked her to tear it apart, like find what I'm getting wrong. And memoir is, to depend solely upon memory when you're writing memoir, I think is folly.
So there's not a whole lot of mention of extended family in the book. Were there other family in your life then?
I'm an only child. And my, I had a cousin, Meredith, who's older than I am by a few years, goodly number of years. And she was kind of an older sister to me, and still remains my closest relative. Meredith does. She lives up in Columbia, South Carolina. But I don't have a large family. When I married my wife, Blair Hobbs, Blair was born in Oxford, grew up in Auburn, Alabama, but all of her family, much of her family, is still centered in Oxford, where she was born. And so when I joined her family, I joined this big, sprawling family of genius people, and I loved that because I didn't know that growing up.
And your older cousin kind of helped get you into the college state of mind.
She did. My parents divorced or separated as I was going off to college in 1980. That summer before I went off to Athens, Georgia in 1980, I went to see a second run showing of Animal House with my cousin Meredith. I took that as kind of an instruction manual. I'm being a little flippant, but not really. I was looking for rebellion. I understand now I was probably angry at my mother for the effects of alcohol and the way it tore our family apart. And I was looking for a way to rebel against the kind of cloistered small town South in which I'd grown up. And there was Animal House, an instruction reel playing on the second run movie theater in West Columbia, South Carolina.
And instead of taking your mother's alcoholism as an object lesson,
I went drinking and dancing. I went hard. I came close to tipping over into the same ditch that swallowed my mother up in college. And there was a moment, when I don't know, I kind of gave up on myself. I defined myself as the wild guy who didn't go to class. I defined myself as the kind of shambling, lost kid. And then I had to hit, and I was a fraternity social chairman, booking bands. That was kind of fun. I booked some really good bands. I booked the Flat Duo Jets one time for $50 and a handle of gin.
I saw Dexter Romweber just got inducted to the North Carolina Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and Nico Case's new album is in part a tribute to Dexter, which I loved. But I was lost at that time, and I really did tip over into my mother's world. But I kind of did what people do. I hit rock bottom and came back out of it, and moved to Atlanta kind of on a whim, and told myself I'd kind of prove to my father, who had always believed in me and saw more promise in me, and more important, probably prove to myself that I could be something other than a dumb, stupid frat boy.
So how did you not become a frat boy and just wear the same shirts and then join the same finance firms?
I was, but I mean, in a way, it was music showed me one path. I write about in the book going to see a concert at Legion Field, an outdoor venue in Athens, and it was a double bill. It may have been a triple bill, but I remember two of the bands. One was REM. REM had formed the summer before I showed up for college. So they are on their rise as I am flailing about in Athens. There was also another band on the bill, Jason and the Nashville Scorchers, Jason Ringenberger. And I remember Jason playing that old Hank Williams song, I Saw the Light. And he's playing it like a dirge. He's playing it slow. And then halfway through the song, he kind of like twists and torques and jumps and begins playing, rock hard. And you see him in that moment reinvent that song. And it took me a while to figure out why I was so attracted to that moment, but I realized that he was reinventing what he was given. He was reinventing the South that he was interpreting. He was twisting it up and turning it around and turning it into something new. And in that moment, only after that moment do I realize the power of that moment. But it's to take the stories you're inherited, which is what I've kind of tried to do with this book. Take the stories you're inherited and rewrite them, retell them, make change.
You talk about the Clinton barbecue joint that you grew up with. How did that inspire you, and then how did your path in life after college bring you to the world of food?
So, I grew up less than 2 miles from a barbecue joint called Old Clinton. Old Clinton, there was sawdust on the floor. There were cedar posts that held up the tin roof. It was a cinder block building. It was just, it was textbook. This is what a barbecue joint is supposed to look like: a sunbeam bread push handle on a screen door on the front, smoke trailing out the chimney. in a lot of ways, you could argue that my interest in food begins there and begins on the road traveling with my father, who was a federal probation officer, and we'd kind of retrace his steps on the weekends and visit barbecue joints that he'd visited on his rounds. But Old Clinton mattered to me because it was kind of a place of escape. I could pedal my bike up there and just cross the highway and end up in this place away from my home where I could get a barbecue sandwich and a Brunswick stew and an orange crush or a Mountain Dew. And that was peaceful and beautiful. And so when I went back to college after flunking out of Georgia, I lived in Atlanta for a while, and then I go back to school to the University of Mississippi to get a graduate degree eventually in Southern Studies, this interdisciplinary study of the South. And I realized then that my interest in places like Old Clinton, an interest born of my father's kind of travel yearning, might be a path for me as I began to think and write about the South.
So how did you find yourself in Oxford?
I was living in Atlanta. This was 1995, the run-up to the Olympics in Atlanta, Centennial Olympics. And there were people parachuting into the South, writing about all these different sorts of Souths. The Gullah Geechee South of South Carolina and North Florida and Georgia. The sponge divers of Tarpon Springs, Florida. Writing about all these different ways that the South manifest. And, growing up in Georgia, in the home of that Confederate Brigadier General, I told myself that I knew the South. But living in Atlanta as the Olympics began, I realized that I didn't really know the South. How could you possibly know a South that contained all that? I heard a speaker say, the South is comparable in size to Western Europe. How could someone in their early 20s know Western Europe? And that inspired me to kind of try to figure out my relationship to the South. Nagging in the back of my head, too, was, the stories I inherited from my mother and from the lost cause about what the South was and what the purpose of the Civil War was and who won the Civil War. I wanted to work through all that. And the Center for the Study of Southern Culture and that interdisciplinary program, when I found out about it, within about 6 weeks, I quit my job, sold my house, and moved to Oxford.
And that was 95?
That was 95.
So how did the Southern Foodways Alliance come to be?
I was still a graduate student in 1998, and I had attended some of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture's programming. I went to the first international conference on Elvis Presley, and I went to the Oxford Conference for the book, and I was really impressed with the way in which the center programming took the subject matter quite seriously, but didn't take itself too seriously. I remember Elvis playing at that first Elvis conference with his Memphis mariachis.
And the Elvettes.
Yep, and the Elvettes, Gladysita and Prisalita, maybe.
Yeah.
I just love that. But he was on the same bill as John Shelton Reed, the eminent professor at the University of North Carolina. And they both had something to say in the moment. And so I had the idea of starting a symposium on Southern food culture in 1998. I was inspired by John Edgerton, who became a mentor to me, and Jessica Harris, who did it well. Jessica writing about African-American foodways, John writing more broadly about the South. I just had an idea, and the center let me explore it, let me take the chance. And so in 1998, I programmed a symposium on Southern food culture, the first Southern Foodways Symposium. And I don't know, 80 people came. It sold out. And out of that came real energy to start an organization which became the Southern Foodways Alliance, which would do documentary work, oral histories and films, would produce a journal and eventually a podcast. All those things came out of the same storytelling instinct. How do we tell new stories from this old place?
And then about 20 years later, after putting so much of your heart and soul into this, a younger generation comes along and says, maybe you're not the person to be doing this anymore.
Yeah, that's so in 20, I got a strong challenge from a younger generation. I also there was a report in the New York Times that I ended up reading to my father, because my father at that point had macular degeneration. I had to read this really hard take on my work to my father. But the way I see it now, then I was hurt and confused and trying to figure out what's going on. I recognize a number of things now that, first, to your point, a younger generation always comes for an older generation. I'd been in my position 20 plus years. I regret I didn't have the vision to see what might come next for me. I also recognize my hubris in that moment, and I write about that in the book, that, my voice was the loudest voice in the room. I was the person with the largest set of amplifiers. I was the person with the best speakers. You could hear my voice maybe a little too much, maybe a lot too much. And looking back on that moment, I was entering into conversations about racism and its legacies and its impact on food, in the months after George Floyd's murder. I didn't need to be in those conversations then. I should have been listening instead of talking.
But now you are able to tell stories still, and you don't have the weight of an organization to have to represent, and you now have an Emmy Award-winning show called True South.
And there's a lot of ways in which that work at the Southern Foodways Alliance is a direct connection to the work we do now for True South. My wife is the best judge of whether, I don't know if this is the case with you, but my wife is the best judge of me when I'm happy doing something. She'll tell me go do more of that. You seem happy. And making True South is joyful. This is our 8th season of making this show. Wright Thompson's the executive producer, and my friend Tim Horgan is our director. And we're trying to actually see the South for what it is. Coming back to that idea of the ways in which myths and the idea of moonlight and magnolias kind of obscure the South. How do you actually see this place for what it is right now? We just made a show that debuted about Ocean Springs, Mississippi. And yes, it's about oysters in Ocean Springs. There's an amazing place there called Eagle Point Oyster Company, and we get to know the guys who run that. We also spend a lot of time at the Thai Buddhist temple in Goshen, Mississippi, set just beneath the water tower, just I think it's like 10, 12 miles from Ocean Springs. If you really look at the South and you look at if you're driving down the road and you watch the roadway unspool and you see the South for what it is today, that Thai temple, which on Sundays from 10 to 3 serves basically like a food court on the back end of it to raise money, with really good pad Thai and cashew chicken, kind of Americanized Thai food. If you really see the South for what it is, that Thai temple has as much to say about the South in this contemporary moment as does that oyster company.
Well, John, I'm sorry we've run out of time. That's the vagaries of TV, as you well know. The House of Smoke, a memoir by John T. Edge. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate the kindness.
And The House of Smoke is published by Crown. I'm Stephen Ussery, and this is Book Talk.